They took my phone, my wallet, and even my glasses, so I wouldn't be able to call for help. That was the first thing I understood when I reached into my bag and found nothing but a torn receipt and a peppermint candy. At 78, I've learned not to panic easily. But that moment felt like someone had quietly pushed me out of my own life and closed the door behind me. I stood by the kitchen counter, blinking at the blurred shapes around me, and realized I was blind in more ways than one. It had happened sometime between the moment Daniel hugged me goodbye, too tightly, too long, and the moment I walked into the living room to find the curtains drawn, though I hadn't closed them. They'd been here, in my home, again. I should have expected it. Lately, every visit from Daniel or Kira left the house feeling slightly rearranged, like someone had lifted my things and put them back just a fraction off. Not enough to call them on it, enough to unsettle. I leaned against the table to steady myself. Without my glasses, everything looked like watercolor left in the rain. But even blurred, I could picture Daniel's expression from earlier. Soft voice, gentle smile, the way he placed his hand on my arm as if I were fragile glassware. "Aunt Margaret, you should let us handle the harder stuff now," he'd said. Harder stuff, by which he meant my finances, my mail, my accounts, anything that made me a person rather than a responsibility. I'd noticed how Kira wandered into my study uninvited, pausing too long by the drawer where I kept my documents. She'd laughed when I asked what she was doing. "Just admiring the old photos," she said. But the photos were on the opposite shelf. The drawer held my bank folder. Back then, I brushed off the discomfort. That's what happens when you spend a lifetime convincing yourself that family means safety. You start overlooking shadows. I reached for the armrest of the chair, lowering myself carefully. My heart beat too loudly in my ears. What else had they taken? What had they looked at? The lamp on the side table pointed the wrong direction. My notebook was gone, my blue one, the one where I wrote down everything I didn't trust my memory to keep. They knew that. They knew how much I relied on it. The house felt wrong. The silence between the walls felt inhabited by other people's intentions. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe slowly. A long life teaches discipline, even when fear tries to sneak its fingers around your throat. I told myself that until I believed it. I told myself that losing my glasses didn't mean losing my mind, and losing my phone didn't mean losing my voice. Still, the truth pressed coldly against my ribs. Without those 3 items, I was as helpless as they hoped I'd be. A car door slammed outside. The sound cracked through the quiet like a warning. I turned my head toward the window. Only a smear of gray and green through my weakened eyes. Another door shut. Quick footsteps on gravel. Daniel's voice. "Aunt Margaret, it's us again. We need to talk." My stomach tightened. They had just left an hour ago. There was no reason to return unless the reason was bad. The doorknob rattled once, then twice, before the door opened without hesitation. They still had the spare key. I didn't move. Something inside me cooled, settled, hardened. It's interesting, really, how the mind works at my age. You'd think fear would come first. But what arrived instead was clarity, a stillness. The understanding that whatever was about to happen had been approaching for months, maybe years, threading itself quietly through small moments I'd chosen not to interpret correctly. Kira stepped inside first, her silhouette a dark blur. "We're taking you with us for a few days," she said too brightly. "It's for your own good. You've been confused lately." Daniel followed, closing the door behind him. "We'll explain in the car. You'll feel better once we get you settled." Settled. Such a gentle word for a cage. My glasses were gone. My phone was gone. My wallet was gone. But they had forgotten one thing. One emergency line they didn't know existed, and I, though nearly blind at that moment, saw everything perfectly. Daniel guided me toward the door with that same false tenderness he had used for months, but now it felt like a grip rather than a gesture. My balance wavered without my glasses. The hallway blurred into soft shapes. I could still see well enough to understand that this wasn't a visit, or a concern, or even a misunderstanding. This was a removal, a relocation under the pleasant disguise of care. "Aunt Margaret, careful with the step," he murmured. His voice used to soothe me when he was a boy. Now it felt like a rope slipping quietly around my wrists. Kira stayed behind me, blocking the house, as if afraid I might turn around and run. "The air will do you good," she said. "A few days away from all this stress." Stress. They meant independence. They meant privacy. They meant the parts of my life they hadn't succeeded in rearranging yet. I felt the outside light sting my eyes. The cool air brushed my face, carrying the smell of damp earth and early evening. Our neighborhood was usually full of noises. Children playing, dogs barking, Mr. Jenkins arguing with his lawnmower, but now everything felt muffled, distant, like the world had politely stepped aside so they could carry out their intentions without an audience. The car door opened. The sound of it, firm, practiced, made my heart thud once, hard. "Just get in," Daniel said softly. "You're safe with us." Safe. That word again. People say it when they want you to stop asking questions. I hesitated at the edge of the seat. He pressed a hand against my back, almost imperceptibly, just enough to tip the balance. I sat down. The seatbelt clicked before I had a chance to reach for it myself. Kira slid in beside me, close enough that her perfume crawled into my nose. Lavender and something metallic underneath. Daniel started the engine. Gravel crunched under the tires as he backed out of my driveway, and took the road east toward the outskirts. I knew that direction even without clear sight. My husband and I had taken that road many times, for picnics, for long drives, for the kind of quiet moments marriage eventually becomes. Now it led somewhere I had no choice in going. I folded my hands in my lap, hiding the shaking of my fingers by pressing them together. "Where exactly are we going?" "To the cabin," Daniel said. "You need rest. Maybe even evaluation. You've misplaced too many things lately." "Because someone has been moving them," I answered, my voice calm but steady. Kira laughed softly, a condescending, almost pitying sound. "Margaret, no one is moving your belongings. You're overwhelmed, and when people your age get overwhelmed..." People your age. The phrase landed like a pebble in a pond, small but sharp, with ripples that reached everywhere. I turned my face toward the window. Without my glasses, the world outside rushed by in streaks, trees, houses, sky. I couldn't tell where one ended and the next began. But I knew enough. They had chosen a time when the neighbors were at work, when no one could see me being escorted out like a child who couldn't be trusted to walk alone. They had chosen a moment when I was unarmed, disoriented. They had chosen well. The car drove for nearly an hour. The turns grew sharper, the road rougher, the air quieter. At some point, Daniel lowered the radio volume until it was barely a whisper, as if sound itself might wake whatever conscience he had silenced inside him. Kira rested her hand lightly on my forearm. Just relax. Everything will make more sense once we're there. You won't have to worry about misplaced phones or missing cards anymore. I didn't misplace them, I said. Silence. Heavy, instructive silence. When we finally stopped, the engine's hum faded into the sound of wind brushing through tall pines. I recognized the scent. Old wood, wild grass, damp stone. Daniel's family cabin. Far enough from town that a scream would dissolve before reaching a soul. He opened my door himself, like a gentleman who doesn't trust the lady to walk. "Here we are," he said. "Let's get you inside." Inside. As though the cabin were a sanctuary and not a holding pen. My knees trembled as I stepped onto the uneven ground. Without my glasses, the cabin was a dark shape against lighter darkness, a rectangle of intentions, a structure too eager to close its mouth around me. When I stumbled slightly, Daniel gripped my elbow again. "See? You're not steady. This is why we're helping you." Helping. Such a strangely shaped word when spoken by someone who has already taken what you need to help yourself. He opened the door. Warm, stale air drifted out. The faint smell of dust. The faint echo of old summers I suddenly missed terribly. "Just a few days," Kira said from behind me, "until we sort everything out." I stepped inside because there was nowhere else to step. And as the door shut behind me, soft but final, I understood the truth. They didn't bring me here to rest. They brought me here to weaken. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that I had survived harder rooms, darker days, deeper loneliness, and I wasn't done yet. Not by a long stretch. The cabin smelled of old summers, pine resin, dust, a faint trace of charcoal from a fireplace unused for years. But beneath it all was something else. Preparation. Someone had been here recently. Someone had cleaned too carefully, arranged too purposefully. The air didn't carry the softness of nostalgia. It carried intention. Daniel turned on a lamp, and even through the blur I knew the place had changed. My husband and I used to keep the furniture simple. 2 wooden chairs, 1 sagging sofa, a table my father built. Now everything was rearranged into a more manageable layout. The chairs moved closer together, the table pushed against the wall, the rugs rolled up so I wouldn't trip. Safety, they would say. Control, I thought. Kira set down a neatly packed bag, my bag, the one from my closet, filled without my permission. "We brought your essentials," she said. "Clothes, toiletries, medications." Medications? I kept mine in a locked drawer. They had found the key. I didn't show my anger. Anger wastes breath, and I needed mine. Daniel gestured toward the sofa. "Sit down, Margaret. We need to explain a few things." Explain. Such a gentle word for decisions already made. I lowered myself onto the sofa, feeling the springs groan beneath me. My vision pulsed with fog, dark outlines shifting like shadows waiting to take shape. Without my glasses, I watched people through the shape of their intentions. Daniel sat across from me, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "We've been worried about you," he began. "You've been misplacing important items, forgetting appointments." "I haven't forgotten a single appointment," I said quietly. "And the things I misplaced are the things someone moved." Kira gave that soft, pitying laugh again. "We know it's hard to accept changes in yourself, but you've needed help for a long time. We're stepping in because it's becoming unsafe." Unsafe. I wondered how many times they had rehearsed that line. Daniel cleared his throat. "Look, this isn't forever. Just until we sort out some paperwork." Your bank accounts, your insurance, the property title. There are things that need to be updated. Updated is another word for transferred if you push it hard enough. I folded my hands in my lap. "Why are my documents here?" I asked. "I saw you brought them." Both froze for a fraction of a second. Not long, but long enough. "You're imagining things," Daniel said too quickly. "We didn't—" "I heard you," I interrupted. "On the porch last week. We'll need her signatures before the end of the month." Those were your words. Kira's smile thinned. "You misheard." I let the silence sit between us like a stone. They underestimated silence. They thought it meant surrender, when in truth it was the safest container for anger until you found a proper use for it. Daniel leaned forward again. "We've talked to a lawyer, just informally, and he suggested that someone responsible take temporary control of your financial decisions, only until things stabilize." Responsible, stabilize. They dressed their greed in soft vocabulary. "And why," I asked, "did you take my phone?" "To keep you from stressing yourself," Kira replied. "You call too many people. You get overwhelmed." "And my wallet?" "You lose things." "And my glasses?" She hesitated. "You dropped them earlier." "I didn't drop them." "Well," she said, voice narrowing, "you don't remember everything you do." There it was, the script. If they could convince me I was confused, then every violation became a correction, every theft became a safeguard, every coercion became love. Daniel stood. "You're tired. Let's settle in. We'll go over everything in the morning." He walked to the small window and pulled the curtains tight. The dim lamp flickered. The shadows swallowed half the room. "You'll stay inside tonight," he said. "The woods can be dangerous. No phone, no lights, just rest. Tomorrow we'll explain everything properly." As if he hadn't already explained enough. Kira gathered her coat. "We'll be back first thing in the morning. And don't try wandering around. You can barely see, Margaret." They walked toward the door. For a moment I thought Daniel might look back. He didn't. He simply shut the door behind them with a quiet click, the kind meant to sound gentle but carried the weight of finality. Their footsteps faded across the porch. The engine started. Gravel shifted. Then nothing. The silence pressed in. I sat alone in that dim cabin, hands trembling in my lap, trying to piece together the edges of danger. I didn't know the full shape yet, but the outline was enough. They weren't simply trying to take care of me. They were trying to take over. And somewhere between their soft smiles and careful lies, they'd forgotten something crucial, something that gave me a thread of hope in this darkened place. They didn't know the whole truth of what was installed inside my home. They didn't know about the emergency line still waiting for my voice. And if I could find a way back to it, I might still have a chance to reclaim my life. The quiet in the cabin wasn't peaceful. It had a thickness to it, like the air itself was waiting for something to happen. I sat still for a long while, letting my eyes adjust to the soft blur of the room. Without my glasses, the world looked smoothed over, but the outlines of danger were sharp enough in my mind. I rose slowly, careful not to lose my balance. Every object was a shadow until I touched it and gave it shape. The sofa, the table, the wall with its rough wooden planks. I ran my fingers along their edges, mapping the room the way a person maps memory. By touch, not sight. The first thing I needed was to know what they'd locked and what they'd forgotten. The front door was the obvious boundary. When I reached it, I felt the cold metal of a new deadbolt, one we never had before. Solid, firm, the kind installed by someone who didn't intend for the person inside to leave. I checked the latch, the hinges, the frame. Nothing gave. I turned back into the room. My blurred gaze caught the darker outline of my bag. I crouched, opening it by feel, clothes, toothbrush, an unfamiliar pill bottle. No phone, no wallet, no glasses. Even the zipper pocket was empty. Daniel and Kira had packed for me, yes, but only the parts that benefited them. I found the pill bottle again, twisting it closer to the lamp. The label was a haze of white and gray. I couldn't read it, not without my glasses, but the weight of the bottle felt wrong. Too light for real medication, too new. Something meant to make me compliant, perhaps. Something they planned to explain away as doctor's orders. I set it aside. The windows were my next hope. I moved toward the nearest one. The curtains felt stiff, freshly washed, as if someone wanted them to block every curious glance. I pulled them apart slightly. Outside, the world dissolved into dark silhouettes of tall pines. I pressed my hands along the frame, searching. Daniel had remembered to latch it. The metal slide clicked under my fingers, firm, not rusted, not stuck. Locked deliberately. The second window was the same. The back door? Barred from the outside. I stepped back, breathing slowly, letting the fear settle into something usable. I'd lived long enough to learn that panic clouds judgment, and judgment was the only weapon I had left. There had to be something they hadn't thought of. Something small. Something only someone who had lived a long life inside her own skin would notice. My fingers found a thin draft by the floorboards near the far wall. I lowered myself carefully, tracing the cold air to its source. A narrow vent, the one my husband had installed decades ago when the summer heat in this cabin had nearly cooked us alive. I remembered him cursing the screws, saying he'd replace them someday. He never did. I touched them now, old, loose, one already wobbling. That vent didn't lead outside, but it connected to the small storage room behind the cabin. And that room, if memory served, had a window that stuck in the winter, but never quite latched properly. A thin path. But a path. I pressed my palm flat against the vent cover. If I could get through that storage room, or even get something from it, a tool, a rope, anything, I'd have a chance. But I didn't have my glasses. To remove the screws, I'd need to feel everything by touch alone. And I'd need time. Quiet time. Time before Daniel returned in the morning with whatever paperwork he expected me to sign. I sat back on my heels, letting the plan take shape inside me like a slow dawn. They assumed age made me helpless. They forgot age also made me patient. I rose again, moving carefully through the dim room, learning each creak in the floor, each shift in the boards. The cabin was a cage now, yes, but it was a cage I once knew intimately, and that meant I could learn it again. By the time I reached the sofa, I understood one thing clearly. They had locked me in, taken what I relied on, counted on my fear to freeze me. But they hadn't taken my memory. They hadn't taken my hands. And they hadn't taken the last thread of hope I carried quietly inside me. Tomorrow, they believed, I would be ready to surrender. But tonight I began planning my way out, my way. Night in the cabin settled differently than night at home. At home, the dark came softly, through curtains, through the familiar creaks of my old house, through the quiet hum of the refrigerator. But here, the dark arrived all at once, thick and complete, like someone had thrown a heavy blanket over the world. The single lamp Daniel had left for me flickered, its warm circle barely reaching the corners of the room. I lay back in the sofa's curve, not to rest, but to think. I had learned long ago that clarity comes only after the mind stops struggling. And tonight, I needed clarity more than comfort. My thoughts drifted, unbidden, to my husband, Arthur. It had been almost 15 years since he passed, but he remained steady in my memory, like an anchor set deep in the ocean floor. He was the one who insisted we install a proper security system in the house after a string of burglaries in the neighborhood. "We're getting older, Maggie," he'd told me. "Better to have something that listens when we can't shout." Back then, I laughed at the idea. A system with voice activation, a silent emergency channel, a backup line routed through the old landline wiring. It all felt unnecessary. But Arthur had insisted, patiently, like he always did when he knew he was right. His voice, low, sure, returned to me now, as if he stood just beyond the edge of the lamp's glow. Redundancy saves lives. One line fails, another takes over. Daniel and Kira didn't know any of that. They never asked. They assumed every elderly woman lived with nothing but a cell phone and an overstuffed purse. They stripped me of both, forgetting the man who built a second life inside our walls, one made of quiet safeguards and emergency exits. If I could get home, if I could reach the living room, one whispered command would activate the system. It would call the security company automatically. It would alert the bank to freeze suspicious transactions. It would notify my lawyer, because Arthur insisted on adding him to the contact chain. My freedom depended not on strength or speed, but distance. The handful of miles between this cabin and the home that still remembered me. I closed my eyes, letting the memory of Arthur's hands guide me. He had shown me every hidden feature of the system, even the ones he didn't think we'd ever use. The tiny microphone tucked inside the mantle, the separate circuit that powered it, the way the emergency line worked even if the phone network was down. "You only have to say the phrase once," he'd said. "The system does the rest." I whispered that phrase now, not to activate anything, but to steady myself. The words tasted like iron and memory. Emergency command, Margaret Holt. Priority 1. Here in the cabin, the phrase meant nothing. The walls didn't know me. But inside my home, it would have been a flare in the dark. A soft shiver passed through me, half hope, half fear. They had taken my glasses, believing that blindness would slow me. They had taken my phone, believing communication was limited to a device. They had taken my wallet, believing identity lived in cards and numbers. They never understood that identity lives in habit. In the muscle memory of a woman who has spent decades walking the same hallway, touching the same mantle, repeating the same emergency phrase that her husband made her practice until she rolled her eyes. I opened my own eyes again. The cabin was silent, except for the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall. But something underneath that silence shifted, a resolve settling into me like the slow placing of stones. If I could get out through the storage room tomorrow night, if I could reach the path before Daniel returned with his papers, I might make it home before they realized I was gone. It wouldn't be easy, but few things worth doing ever are, especially at my age. I pulled the thin blanket over my knees, feeling the stiffness in them, the ache in my hips. Age carried its weight, yes, but it also carried experience. And tonight, the balance began to tilt in my favor. I whispered one more thing into the darkness, something not meant for any system, only for Arthur, wherever he rested. "You were right. Again." Then I folded my hands, breathed steadily, and let the night turn into preparation. Morning didn't arrive gently. It pushed in through the cabin windows as a harsh, pale blur, flattening every shape into a smear of white and gray. I opened my eyes slowly, feeling the stiffness in my back from the sofa and the dull ache in my fingers from holding tension all night. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then the silence reminded me. The silence of being hidden. The silence of being controlled. The silence of a place chosen for me, not by me. I sat up, letting the blanket fall to the floor. My bare feet met the cold boards with a small flinch. The cabin had always been drafty. Arthur meant to fix that too, but never managed before his heart gave out on a September morning. I pushed the thought away. I needed clarity now, not grief. I listened. No voices outside, no car, no footsteps crunching over pine needles. They wouldn't come early, not today. They believed I would be docile, fogged, obedient. They thought last night's fear would soften me. Instead, it sharpened me like a whetstone. I rose carefully, feeling out the walls with my palms the way I had done in the dark. The lamp was off now, but daylight leaked through the curtains well enough for me to sense the shapes of things. I went to the front door first, not because I believed it would miraculously open, but because I needed to confirm the truth again. The deadbolt held firm under my touch. New metal. No give. I moved to the windows next. My fingertips traced the latch, tight, unmoving. They had checked these. They wanted me contained, but not harmed. They needed my signatures, after all. For that, I had to stay breathing. But the storage vent, that was something they hadn't considered. I knelt by the floorboards, wincing at the sharp pressure on my knees. Age does not forgive sudden movements, but age also teaches how to endure them. I ran my hand along the vent cover until I felt the first screw, loose enough to wiggle, just as I remembered. I twisted it with my fingers, slow and steady. It resisted, then gave. 1 turn. 2. 3. It loosened, but not enough to remove fully. My thumb slipped twice. The metal edge bit into my skin. A small sting of pain, a necessary one. I paused, breathing through the tremble in my hands. I had to be patient. I had to work quietly. Daniel might have said they'd return in the morning, but that could mean anything. 9, 10, noon. I needed to make progress before the sound of their tires reached the cabin. My palms brushed the boards around the vent. Dust. Splinters. Then, something else. A faint scrape, different from the rest. The corner of the baseboard was chipped, just enough that I could slip a fingernail beneath it. Had I noticed this years ago? Perhaps. Or perhaps time had loosened more than age. Wood shrinks, boards shift. The world decays for everyone, not just the old. I pressed gently until the board lifted the smallest amount, not enough to remove, enough to remind me. The room was older than Daniel's intentions, and older things always have weaknesses. I returned to the vent, working another screw. This one budged more easily, turning with a gritty sound that made my breath catch. I froze, listening. Nothing. No movement outside. No voices. Only the wind brushing the trees. When the second screw loosened, the vent cover shifted. Not by much. But it was movement, and movement meant possibility. I stood slowly, my joints protesting. I walked through the cabin again, learning its rhythm. The creak by the fireplace. The soft spot near the table. The way the light changed across the floor. I needed to know every inch if I was going to move through it freely when night came. My eyes burned from straining to see shapes that refused to become clear. Without my glasses, the world was a watercolor, but I could still tell that the shadows near the corner were deeper now. that the broom leaning against the wall was the same old one Arthur used to bring up from the shed. That the wooden cupboard by the kitchen had a narrow gap underneath it, a gap just wide enough to hide something small. I bent, sliding my hand underneath. Dust, a pebble, then something thin and metallic. My fingers closed around it, a flathead screwdriver. I nearly laughed, quietly, but with a warmth I hadn't felt in hours. Daniel and Kira had cleaned the cabin, but not thoroughly. They didn't know its history. They didn't know how many times Arthur fixed things halfway and left tools scattered in places only habitual hands remembered. I held the screwdriver like a lifeline. Not a weapon, no, I wasn't foolish, but a key. A tool for a woman who still had work to do. I set it by the vent. Tonight, the vent would open. Tonight, I would reach the storage room. Tonight, I would step closer to home. But for now, I moved through the cabin with quiet purpose, collecting what I could. A few cloth scraps, a loose nail, an old tin box. Small things, insignificant to anyone else. But for someone in my position, they were pieces of a map. When I finally sat on the sofa again, the screwdriver cold against my palm, I whispered into the still air. "You underestimated me, Daniel. That was your mistake, not mine." And the room, old and wise, seemed to hold the words gently, as if agreeing. By midday, the light in the cabin had shifted to a dull, silvery glow, the kind that makes everything look colder than it is. I sat at the small kitchen table, my fingertips brushing the grain of the wood, while my mind assembled and reassembled the same thought. If I miscalculated, even by a little, Daniel and Kira would find me halfway through escape, and that would be the end of any control I still possessed. Timing, not strength, would save me. I moved back to the vent and crouched, sliding the screwdriver beneath the first screw. My knees ached, sharp and insistent, but I kept going. The metal squeaked quietly as I turned it, one slow rotation at a time. I paused after every few seconds to listen. The woods outside remained still. No car, no voices. No sound except wind dragging its fingers through pine needles. The first screw came out fully, dropping into my palm like a tiny victory. I placed it gently on the floor beside me. The second screw followed with less resistance. My hands steadied as the work continued. This kind of motion lived deep in my memory. Years ago, I'd fixed Arthur's radio this same way. Small, deliberate movements. Nothing rushed. The third screw was stubborn, rusted, or maybe stripped. My thumb slipped, scraping the wood. I steadied myself with a long breath and tried again. The screwdriver barely caught the edge, but it turned just enough. Another turn. Another. Patience is a kind of strength, too, one learned only after living long enough to see how little brute force matters. Finally, it loosened. The vent cover sagged slightly. I slid my fingers beneath it and lifted. It moved. Not enough to crawl through, my body wouldn't fit anyway, but enough to grant access to the storage room beyond, where the siding didn't sit, flush, and the internal boards left a gap big enough to reach through. I lay flat on the floor, my cheek against the cold wood, and reached inside. My fingers brushed emptiness first, then dust, then something rough. A crate. I remembered it. Arthur had kept old tools there. Useless things he refused to throw away because you never know when an old thing might be the exact thing you need. I felt inside the crate. A hammer handle. Too big. A rusty wrench. Too heavy. Then rope. Coiled, thin, scratchy from age but intact. I pulled it toward me inch by inch until it slid through the opening. Useful. Very useful. I looked again, stretching my arm further. My fingertips found one more object. A metal hook, the kind used for hanging lanterns. I dragged it closer. Another tool. Another chance. I sat up slowly, my breath trembling, not from fear now, but from the weight of possibility. These small items, forgotten by everyone but me, could mean the difference between escaping and staying locked in this place until Daniel decided I was docile enough to sign away whatever he wanted. I tested the rope. It wasn't long, but long enough to secure the window latch in the storage room, if I could reach that room tonight. Long enough to create leverage where fingers alone might fail. The next step was observation. I stood and walked to the window. Even in my blurred sight, the outline of the woods remained static, unmoving. But the sky was changing, thinning light, deepening shadows. Afternoon crawling toward evening. Daniel had said he'd return in the morning, but I didn't trust him. People who lie easily often arrive early. I drank water from the tap, cold, metallic, and forced myself to eat a dry cracker from the bag they'd packed. I needed strength, not comfort. Then I moved through the cabin again, checking every possible path. The back door, barred from outside, no give. The windows, latched, sturdy. The small bedroom, empty, except for a mattress and thin blanket. But the floorboard near the dresser caught my attention. When I stepped on it, it dipped slightly. I crouched and pressed my palm against the edge. It rose just enough to suggest a hollow beneath. I slid my fingers under and lifted. A gap large enough to store something small. But nothing was inside now. Still, knowing where quiet space existed mattered. By dusk, the cabin felt less like a trap and more like a puzzle, one that time, memory, and stubbornness would allow me to solve. I gathered everything: the rope, the metal hook, the screwdriver, the cloth scraps. I wrapped them in one of the old towels and tied it loosely, making a small bundle I could carry in the dark. Then I sat in the silence and listened. A distant engine rumbled, too far to be Daniel's, but close enough to tighten my breath. It faded. The woods settled again. Night approached, slow and deliberate, and with it, my chance. I placed my hand over the vent, feeling the faint breeze of the storage room beyond, and whispered to myself, not out of fear, but affirmation. Tonight, I move. Because if I didn't, tomorrow Daniel would come with papers he expected me to sign, and I would lose more than my glasses or my phone. I would lose the rest of my life. Night arrived not as darkness, but as a slow erasure. First the edges of the room softened, then the shadows deepened, and finally, the world collapsed into a single muted shape. Without my glasses, the cabin dissolved into outlines. Enough for direction, not enough for comfort. But comfort was not what I needed. Tonight was for motion. I waited until the woods outside fell into that particular stillness, when even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Daniel and Kira would not return now. They believed I had no means to try anything. They believed old age made me obedient. People often confuse frailty with surrender. I crouched by the vent, bundle in hand, and eased the cover aside. The opening was small, but my arm fit through easily. I slid the bundle in first, guiding it toward the storage room. Then I slid myself forward until my shoulder pressed against the edge of the vent. My breath moved dust into tiny clouds. I ignored the coughing tickle in my throat. The storage room smelled of old wood and trapped air, damp, familiar. My fingers brushed the crate, then the uneven boards behind it. I pulled myself deeper until my head and one shoulder slipped through the opening. My body would never fit entirely. I knew that. But I didn't need to go through. I only needed to reach what lay beyond the vent. My hand found the rope bundle. Good. I unwrapped it slowly, using touch alone to separate each item. The hook, the cloth, the screwdriver. I kept the screwdriver in my hand. Now the hardest part, the window. The storage room window was high across the far wall. I remembered that from years ago. Arthur always complained about hitting his head on its low frame outside. But from the inside, it meant reaching upward blindly through a narrow gap. I stretched my arm as far as I could. My shoulder scraped the wood, sending a sharp sting through my skin. I kept going. My fingertips met cold glass, then the latch, old metal, slightly bent, stubborn, but not locked, just wedged by age. I wrapped the cloth around the screwdriver handle to muffle the sound and slipped the tip beneath the latch. A gentle nudge. The metal protested with a tiny groan. I froze, listened. Nothing. Another nudge, firmer this time. The latch shifted. Again. Again, until finally it lifted. The window loosened. A tiny rush of night air spilled in, carrying pine sap and damp earth. I inhaled it as if it were freedom itself. Now the rope. I hooked it around the bottom of the window frame, pulled to test it. It held. Barely, but enough. I tugged again, making sure the frame wouldn't slam shut when I released it. It stayed. I exhaled shakily. This was the path. It would take everything I had to climb through the storage room once I got the vent fully open, but after that, it was just the woods and my memory of the trail home. Just. As if that small word reduced the miles or the dark. I pulled myself back into the cabin, inch by inch, until my shoulder slid free of the vent. I left the cover unfastened. It would waste precious seconds to replace it. The rope and tools remained in the storage room, waiting for the moment I could move fully. I sat back against the wall, heart thudding. The hardest part was coming, and I knew it. Crawling through that window, navigating the woods half blind. But I had no choice. Morning would bring Daniel, and papers, and decisions made without me. Tonight was my single hour of possibility. I pressed my palm against the floor to steady myself. Move quietly, I whispered. To survive, move quietly. And the night, deep and listening, made no argument. The moment the window in the storage room loosened, the night outside seemed to lean in, as if listening. I waited until my breath steadied, until my heartbeat calmed enough not to drown out the sounds of the woods. Nothing moved beyond the glass. Nothing shifted in the trees. Safe enough. Now came the part that demanded quiet courage, the kind a woman learns over decades, not days. I slid through the vent opening as far as my bones allowed, pushing my bundle ahead of me. The wood scraped my arms, my ribs, my hips. Pain was unavoidable, but pain felt like something I could bargain with. Panic, I could not. So I breathed carefully, slowly, as if each inhale were part of a negotiation. Once my upper body was inside the storage room, I reached for the rope I had secured. The window was open just enough to create a sliver of darkness, cold air brushing my forehead. It smelled like pine needles and freedom. I pulled myself toward it, inch by inch. My shoulder caught on the edge. I twisted slightly and pushed again. My breath grew tight, but finally, I felt my hands reach the window frame. The night outside was nothing but a dark blur, but the earth beneath it was real, solid. Waiting. I pushed the window farther. It groaned but didn't protest loudly enough to betray me. Then I lowered myself out. My foot searched blindly for ground. Found it. Soft soil. Damp leaves. I was out. For a moment, I simply stood there, one hand pressed to the cabin wall, steadying myself. The woods stretched in dark silence, but I knew them well enough. Arthur and I had walked these paths in younger years. Less sight, more memory. I tightened the blanket around my shoulders, grabbed the screwdriver for comfort, if not use, and stepped into the trees. The first few minutes were the hardest. My world was made of smears, tree trunks blending into shadows, rocks dissolving into patches of darkness. But I moved slowly, letting my feet remember what my eyes could not. The dip in the earth by the old birch, the soft patch where moss grew thick, the narrow path where we used to walk side by side. I whispered Arthur's name once, not in fear but in presence. I could almost feel him guiding my steps. The cold air bit at my skin. Branches brushed my arms. My knees protested every uneven inch. Once, I stumbled on a root and had to brace myself against a tree. "Not now," I murmured. "Not tonight." And I kept going. Minutes expanded into something like hours. But eventually the trees thinned. The air grew less wild, and the faint outline of the road appeared. A pale, wavering ribbon under the moon. I followed it. When I finally saw the shape of my house at the far bend, just a smudged silhouette against the sky, something inside me loosened, almost to breaking. My legs moved faster than they should have. My chest ached. But I reached the porch. My hand found the railing, then the doorframe. Home. Inside, the darkness was familiar, not threatening. Every shadow belonged to me. I made my way to the living room by touch alone. My fingers grazed the mantel, the spot where Arthur had installed the hidden microphone. A small tremor passed through me. Not fear, relief. I leaned closer, letting my breath warm the air. "Emergency command," I whispered, voice unsteady but clear. "Margaret Holt, priority 1. A faint click sounded somewhere inside the wall, a tiny acknowledgement. The system was awake. It would call the security company. It would alert my lawyer. It would freeze any suspicious activity at the bank. It would do all the things Arthur had promised. And somewhere far behind me, miles away in that cabin, Daniel and Kira had no idea the world had just shifted out of their hands. The click inside the wall was so soft I could have imagined it, but I didn't. I knew the sound. Arthur had made me practice until I could recognize it even half asleep. The relay switching, the system waking, the signal leaving the house through a wire no one had touched in years. It meant the call had already begun, silent, automatic, impossible to intercept. I stood still, one hand braced on the mantel. My breath trembled. I wasn't safe yet, not by a long stretch, but the smallest corner of my fear loosened. Someone out there now knew something was wrong. The house hummed faintly, the kind of hum you don't hear unless you've lived long enough with its heartbeat. The emergency line triggered 3 paths: security response, financial freeze, legal alert. In that order. Arthur had insisted on it. "Money disappears faster than a person does," he said. "Let the bank hear trouble first." I shuffled toward the armchair and lowered myself into it. My legs were shaking harder than I wanted to admit. The woods had taken more from me than I realized. Every joint throbbed, my breath barely settled. But I couldn't rest yet. A sharp beep echoed from the old landline base. It wasn't a ring, just the system confirming that a message had been delivered. Somewhere downtown, a security operator would now have my address flashing red on a monitor. They'd call back, of course. And when no one answered, because I had no phone, they'd dispatch someone. Not immediately. These things took minutes, sometimes more. Still, help was coming. Quietly, like a distant tide. I closed my eyes just long enough to steady the spinning in my head. For a moment the room seemed to sway. Pain gathered behind my temples. Fatigue crept up my spine like cold fingers. I pressed my palms together until they stopped shaking. Not yet. I couldn't fall apart yet. From outside came a faint rustle. Branches shifting. Perhaps an animal crossing the yard. But it felt too deliberate. Too close. I forced myself up and went to the window, though all I saw was a smear of darkness. My ears sharpened instead of my eyes. Nothing. Then something. A distant engine. Not close, but not far. A tremor rippled through me. Daniel had noticed the cabin door ajar by now. He'd discovered the vent, the open window, the missing rope, my absence. He'd be driving fast. The system needed more time. And I needed to be somewhere other than standing helpless in the middle of the living room when he arrived. I moved through the house, touching each piece of furniture like greeting an old friend. My body knew this place, even if my eyes didn't. I reached the hallway, then the small cabinet where Arthur kept tools and old electrical parts. The door stuck slightly, then gave. Inside, behind a row of dusty fuses, my fingers found the backup battery pack connected to the security line, the one Arthur installed after a storm cut power for 2 days. He'd been so proud of it, telling me, "Even if the house goes dark, the message goes out." Thank God for stubborn men who over-prepare. A second beep sounded from the landline base, then another. The system was sending updates, confirmations, redundancies. If the signal hadn't reached the security office the first time, it had by now. Outside, the engine grew louder, closer. Gravel under tires. My breath caught. My pulse throbbed at my throat. They were nearly here. I moved toward the staircase, not to flee upstairs, but to position myself away from the door. The emergency chain was active. The bank would already be freezing accounts. My lawyer would be receiving an alert, likely calling the police himself. And the security team, yes, they would come soon. I gripped the banister. Daniel's car stopped outside. The headlights, blurry halos, cut across my window. The house was quiet except for the faint hum inside the walls. Help was coming. But so was he. And for the next few minutes, I would be alone between both forces, caught in the space where women like me have always had to stand, silent, steady, waiting for the world to decide which side it was on. Daniel didn't knock. He never did when he felt entitled to a space. The door flew open with a force that rattled the frame, and cold air spilled into the hallway like the night itself had been dragged inside. I stood halfway up the staircase, one hand on the railing, watching his blurred outline fill the doorway. "Aunt Margaret?" His voice was sharp, breathless. "Where are you?" I didn't answer. Silence was my last shield. He stepped farther in, closing the door behind him, not gently, but in a way that said he wasn't leaving without what he came for. His shoes crushed pine needles he must have tracked in from the woods. My woods. The same ones he'd dragged me away from earlier this week, and the same ones I'd navigated tonight to return home. Kira wasn't with him. Good. One less voice trying to shape my reality. "You shouldn't have left the cabin," he said, moving toward the living room. "It wasn't safe. You could have gotten lost. You could have fallen. You need help, and you don't see it. I gripped the banister tighter. I see more than you think. He turned toward the staircase, his blurred face lifting as he spotted my outline. A muscle in his jaw tightened. Come down, he said. We have things we need to fix, papers we need to go over. You scared us disappearing like that. You didn't look scared when you drove away this morning. His shoulders shifted, a subtle, irritated movement. You're confused. Let me take you back. We'll talk when you've rested. Rest. Every manipulator's favorite prescription. Before he could take another step, a faint chirp sounded from the landline base. Once? Twice? He froze. What was that? I let the silence answer him for a moment, just long enough for his certainty to crack. Then I said, very quietly, someone knows. His breath caught. The dim light from the hallway lamp cast him in a thin halo of pale gold and shadow. But even with my ruined sight, I saw the tension ripple through him. What did you do? He whispered. I told the truth, I said. To the one system you didn't think to take away from me. The house answered for me as well. A faint hum shifted in the wall, the relay circuit re-engaging. Daniel's eyes darted toward the sound. No, he muttered, stepping toward it as if he could undo a signal already gone. You don't know how to use that system. You can't even see the buttons. There were never buttons, I said. Just a voice. Mine. He stared at me. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw something break through his impatience. Fear. Not of me, but of consequences. Of the world outside this house, the one he believed he could delay, manipulate, or control. He moved quickly then, heading toward the phone base. I stepped down one stair, just enough for him to hear the creak of wood. Touch it, I warned him, and every second you gain will cost you 10 later. He hesitated. The confidence drained from his posture, leaving something brittle behind. A car door slammed outside. Daniel spun toward the sound. So did I, my heart thudding so loudly it felt unreasonable for someone my age. The headlights, blurry but unmistakable, cut across the window. Another vehicle pulled up behind it. More doors opened. Footsteps. Several. I didn't call anyone, Daniel said, voice rising. I know, I replied. He turned back to me, his outline shaking. You don't understand. This can ruin everything. You're making a mistake. Then it's my mistake to make, I said, steady as stone. The porch creaked. A knock, firm, official, echoed through the door. Security response, a voice called. Mrs. Holt, we received an emergency alert. Daniel closed his eyes. A long, defeated exhale left him, as if the world had just sealed itself shut around him. And downstairs, the house waited. Quiet, loyal, remembering the command I'd given it, remembering me. The moment Daniel opened the door, the house exhaled. Quiet, relieved, as if it had been holding its breath alongside me. 2 security officers stood on the porch, outlines sharp even through my blurred vision. Their voices carried the firm cadence of people accustomed to emergencies, not excuses. Mrs. Holt? The taller one asked. Are you safe? I gripped the banister, stepping down slowly until I reached the last few stairs. I'm here, I said. My voice felt steadier than my legs did. Daniel turned sharply toward me. This is unnecessary, he said quickly. My aunt gets confused. She wandered off. We brought her home, and she must have triggered something accidentally. Sir, the officer interrupted, calm but pointed. The alert was triggered with a verbal priority code. That can't happen by accident. Daniel's silence was short, but telling. The officer stepped inside, scanning the room. "Mrs. Holt, do you need medical attention?" "No," I said. "I need to finish speaking." The shorter officer glanced toward Daniel. "Is he family?" "He's my nephew," I answered. "And I would prefer he didn't speak for me." Daniel's breath hitched, the sound of a man whose script has suddenly been taken from his hands. The taller officer nodded. "Understood. Do you feel you're in any danger from him?" I didn't rush the answer. It wasn't fear that guided my words now, but clarity. The same clarity that had followed me through the woods. "I feel," I said, "that he has acted in ways meant to isolate me, to control access to my home, and to interfere with my financial and personal autonomy." The room went still, as if the walls strained to catch each syllable. Daniel found his voice. "She's misinterpreting." "Enough," I said softly. Not sharp, not angry, simply final. That single word did what a dozen accusations could not. It closed the space Daniel had been trying to keep open between us. He fell quiet. The officers exchanged a glance, the kind that carries silent agreement and silent procedure. Then the taller one lifted a small device from his belt. "Mrs. Holt, your attorney has also flagged concerns," he said. "He received the same emergency alert and notified police dispatch. A unit is already on its way." My breath caught, not in fear, but in something like gratitude. Arthur's planning, my voice, the system he insisted on, it had all worked. Daniel seemed to deflate, the fight draining from him as reality arranged itself around him. "You don't understand what you're causing," he whispered. "We were trying to help you. You can't live alone anymore. You can't manage everything on your own." I stepped off the last stair, steadying myself with the banister. "Needing help," I said quietly, "is not the same as surrendering control. You didn't offer help. You took it." His face blurred, but the shape of it, the defeated slump, the tremor of disbelief, was unmistakable. "You think this will fix anything?" he murmured. "No," I replied, "but it will reveal everything." Outside, another car door shut. Police voices drifted in, firm, methodical. Kira's voice appeared, too, strained, panicked, trying to explain something quickly. She must have followed him from the cabin. The officers moved aside as two uniformed police stepped in. Questions began. Documentation, statements, protocol. The room filled with the quiet machinery of truth being assembled piece by piece. I answered calmly, fact by fact. No embellishments, no drama. The story didn't need decoration. Reality carried its own weight. Eventually, Daniel was asked to step outside. He hesitated, then obeyed. Not a word to me, not a glance back. When the door closed behind him, the house settled again, the tension thinning into something gentler. I sank into my armchair, exhausted in a way only survival can cause. The officer nearest me spoke softly. "You did the right thing, Mrs. Holt. People underestimate what isolation does. You spoke up before it went further?" I nodded. "I spoke because someone taught me to prepare for the day I might not be heard." The officer gave a small, respectful nod. "You were heard tonight." And for the first time in days, maybe longer, I allowed myself to believe it. The house was quiet again by the time the police cars pulled away. Their tail lights faded into the dark, leaving my street as still as it had been before all of this began. I sat in my armchair, wrapped in the blanket I'd grabbed on instinct earlier, the fabric still smelling faintly of cedar from the closet. My hands lay folded in my lap. They trembled only a little. The officers had promised to return in the morning with updates, paperwork, next steps. They spoke kindly, but the truth behind their words was simple. The process had started. It wouldn't stop for Daniel's panic, Kira's excuses, or my fatigue. And that was good. Necessary. But I felt the weight of it all settle into me like something old, familiar, inevitable. When the house had finally emptied, I walked slowly into the kitchen. Each step reminded me of my age, but also of my endurance. I fumbled along the counter until my fingers found the kettle. I filled it, set it on the stove, and waited for the soft hiss of heating water. I didn't need tea. I needed the ritual of it, the steadying repetition that had kept me anchored through worse days. As the water warmed, I opened the drawer where I kept my spare glasses. Not the newest pair, Daniel had taken those, but the old ones with the scratched lenses. They were exactly where they had always been. Waiting. I slid them on, and the world sharpened just enough to make me feel tethered again. The reflection in the dark window startled me. Not because I looked older, I'd made peace with that long ago, but because I looked present. Awake in a way I hadn't for months. Losing everything I depended on had forced me to see everything I'd ignored. When the tea was ready, I carried the cup back to the living room and sat down again, letting the heat settle into my hands. The house was dim, but it was mine. Every corner, every creak, every stubborn drawer Arthur never fixed. My life, flawed as it was, still lived here. But I had to face the truth that hurt more than the bruises on my ribs or the ache in my knees. Part of why Daniel had been able to do what he did was because I had allowed him too much room. Not through weakness, but through hope. The kind of hope older women often cling to. The hope that family means safety, that love excuses thoughtlessness, that silence buys peace. I had given silence far too much power. Now I would speak in ways that couldn't be ignored. My lawyer would arrive in the morning. I knew his habits well enough. He wouldn't wait for a formal appointment. The emergency alert had rattled him, rightfully so. We would sit at my dining table, and I would tell him everything. The isolated cabin, the stolen items, the papers Daniel mentioned, and he would begin building the walls I hadn't built for myself soon enough. New authorizations, new protections, new boundaries. I sipped my tea and let the thought settle. These changes weren't about revenge. They were about reclaiming the quiet dignity that had been chipped away piece by piece, hidden under the guise of care. I thought of Daniel's face earlier, shocked, not by guilt, but by disbelief that I had acted. That I had fought back. He never imagined I had the will or the means. He saw age, not agency. Many people do. But the truth is simpler than he ever understood. Age doesn't strip you of strength. It strips you of illusions. In that clarity, you learn to protect what matters. When the tea was gone, I set the empty cup beside me and leaned back. The night outside was deep, but not threatening. Tomorrow would be long, full of questions and forms and decisions. But I felt something inside me settle. Something steady and clean. I had made it home. I had spoken the command. I had been heard. And now, slowly, I would rebuild the boundaries that should have never been crossed. Morning light slid across my living room in a narrow golden band, catching dust in the air and turning it into something soft, almost gentle. I sat at the dining table with my old glasses perched crookedly on my nose and the documents my lawyer brought spread neatly before me. He had arrived earlier than expected, as I knew he would, carrying concern behind the calm professionalism in his voice. We went through everything slowly. I answered his questions with the same quiet clarity I had held onto all night. When I finished describing the cabin, the isolation, the missing items, he closed his folder and simply looked at me for a long moment. Not with pity, with respect. "Mrs. Holt," he said, "we'll take this from here." For the first time in a long while, I believed someone fully. It took hours to complete all the forms, revoking Daniel's access to anything bearing my name, removing his emergency permissions, updating property protections, putting formal restrictions on who could act on my behalf. The security company sent their own representative as well, walking me through new verification steps and confirming the emergency logs. And when all the immediate damage had been contained, my lawyer folded his hands and asked softly, "Is there anything else you want to secure?" I knew the answer before he finished the question. "Yes," I said. "There's something I should have done sooner." Sophia, Daniel's daughter, 16 years old, the only one in that family who looked at me like I was still a person and not an obligation. She came by sometimes after school, never for money, never for favors, just to sit with me. Quiet girl, gentle voice, always reading something, always leaving notes on my kitchen table that said things like, "Thank you for the tea," or "Your roses are still blooming." I don't know when Daniel's heart hardened or how Kira learned to dress selfishness as concern, but Sophia, she carried a softness they never managed to crush. "I want to set up a trust," I told my lawyer, "for Sophia, educational, future needs only, accessible to her alone when she turns 18. He nodded as if he'd expected exactly that. "We can do that today." And we did. Form by form, signature by signature, I rewrote a portion of my future and hers, not as revenge, not as punishment, but as recognition. A quiet answer to a child who had shown me more real care than her parents ever attempted. When the paperwork was complete, he slid the folder back toward me. "This protects her," he said, "and it protects you." I closed the folder gently. My fingers rested on the cover for a moment longer than necessary. Good. That's enough. When he left, the house felt different. Not lighter, not exactly, but aligned again. A space reordered after a long imbalance. I walked into the small room where Arthur used to work on his endless repairs. Sunlight filtered through the window, painting the dust in warm strokes. I stood there quietly, letting the memory of him settle over me. Not the grief, just the steadiness. "You'd approve," I whispered into the stillness. Maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't. But he taught me to prepare, to protect, to think ahead. And this trust for Sophia, felt like an extension of that preparation, a way to build something good from something broken. By afternoon, exhaustion set in. My knees ached, my hands throbbed, and the house felt heavier with the weight of the day. But beneath it all was a sense of calm, deep and anchored. The damage Daniel tried to do had been halted. The boundaries had been rebuilt. And Sophia's future, whatever shape it took, would not be tied to the ruin her parents had attempted to make of mine. When I finally sat down again, tea warming my palms, I understood the truth I'd been circling since the night in the cabin. Sometimes protection isn't about walls. Sometimes it's about choosing who inherits your strength. And today, I chose well. The evening settled slowly over my house, filtering in through the quiet like a gentle, practiced exhale. Not the sharp, watching silence of the cabin, and not the trembling stillness of the night Daniel arrived. This was different. a silence that belonged to me again, unforced, unbroken, familiar. I sat by the living room window with a cup of chamomile tea cooling in my hands. The worst was behind me now. The officers had come again, asked more questions, taken more notes. My lawyer had called twice with updates, precise, measured, reassuring. The investigation would be thorough, he promised. My accounts were already locked from interference, my documents secure, my home flagged for protective monitoring. But none of that felt like the true ending. The true ending, for me, lived in the small, ordinary things returning to their rightful place. My glasses lying on the side table, my old robe hanging on its hook, the faint tick of the kitchen clock, steady, unhurried. Things that had been taken from me and returned not by force, but by my own voice, my own decision to act. At 78, that felt like its own victory. Outside, the street lamp cast a warm blur over the sidewalk. The neighbors' houses glowed softly through partially drawn curtains. People lived their lives again, unaware that only a night earlier, mine had been on the verge of vanishing beneath someone else's plans. I sipped my tea. The warmth moved through my chest slowly, untangling the last knots of fear inside me. What Daniel and Kira had done wasn't born out of sudden cruelty. Cruelty rarely arrives suddenly. It grows quietly in the spaces where people convince themselves their wants are needs, their entitlement is duty, their control is care. Daniel had been walking toward that version of himself for a long time. I had simply refused to see it, but seeing clearly now didn't make me vindictive, only resolved. I stood and walked toward the mantel, the same place where my lips had whispered the emergency command that saved me. I pressed my fingers lightly against the wood. A small gesture, a thank you, perhaps, or a farewell to the fear that had lived in me these last days. Sophia arrived just after sunset, stepping in through the open door as though afraid I might be asleep. I saw her silhouette before I saw her face. Nervous shoulders, careful steps. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice trembling. I smiled, a slow, steady thing. "I am now." She came closer then, hesitated, and finally sat beside me. She didn't ask about the cabin, or the arguments, or the police cars. She just held my hand, warm and small, and said, "I'm sorry for what my parents did." "None of it was your doing," I answered, "and none of it becomes yours to carry." She nodded, tears clinging to her lashes. Such a tender child in a house that didn't know tenderness. "You'll be all right," I said softly. "Your future will be all right." Her brow furrowed slightly. She didn't know yet about the trust, about the protections I'd placed quietly in her name. That conversation would come later, when the dust settled and the lawyers finished their work. For now, all she needed was reassurance that her life wouldn't be shaped by her parents' mistakes. We sat that way for a long time, saying very little. Sometimes the truest endings are made of quiet rather than declarations. When she finally left, the sky had darkened fully. I closed the door gently behind her and leaned against it for a moment, letting the stillness settle around me. I wasn't the same woman who had sat frightened in this room 2 nights ago. Something inside me had cracked, then reformed. Slower, stronger, sharper. Not an armor, but a kind of inner alignment. Dignity restored, not as a banner, but as a quiet truth. I returned to my chair, letting the night settle. In the end, I didn't rise against my nephew with anger. I rose with clarity. And clarity at my age, is more powerful than rage ever could be. I looked toward the window one last time before sleep, seeing nothing clearly, but feeling everything clearly. I had survived. I had protected myself. I had protected someone worth protecting. And in the silence of my own home, that was enough. So if anyone ever tells you that growing older means growing smaller, disappearing, losing your place in the world, don't believe them. Quiet strength is still strength. Age isn't erasure, and your voice, however soft, can still break open the dark. And if you're ever made to feel powerless, overlooked, or pushed aside, remember my story. And speak, even if your voice trembles. Especially then. If this story resonated with you, stay with me. There are more voices like mine waiting to be heard.